Hi, my name's Kathy Millett, and this week we're looking at how you make computer-cut vegetation, such as from a Brother Scanncut machine, cut silhouettes, into actual plants. So in the last video, we looked at the Brother Scanncut machine and how it could cut out amazingly useful ferns, such as these ones. And they look awesome, but how do you get from that to something a little bit more like this? Well, these ferns are very simple to make up, and I've done them in a number of different scales. So this is a really large scale, and yeah, it'll just about suit my Master Chief diorama in size. It's quite big even for that. And then I've got the smaller scale ones that I did. This fits in the palm of my hand, probably a little large for HO. If you're doing just a normal fern, but great in O scale or some of those other ones. And you can go smaller still, and you can do loads of different plants, ferns, leaves, anything you fancy. I even did one small upright plant. Now, these are my test ones, and I might not use them on the diorama because the one downside was this was done with paper, and much as I love these, on these big flat plants, leaves, you can see the pattern from the paper because it had a pattern on it. And this has no pattern, so I'm rather hoping when these are done, they're all going to go on my diorama and they will look amazing. But in the meanwhile, I've practiced with all of these and I've been really pleased how they came out. So I'm going to show you how to make them the same way. So how do we get to here from here? Well, first of all, we need to put the stems, the fronds, or they all attach to something. So what we're after, I'm going to use this big one because it's big, is to put a line underneath on all of these. And it will be different depending what the plant is. So those ones, it runs along the leaf, does that on these cheese plants, but on this one, it sticks straight on to the underneath. And each one of these requires just a slightly different technique. Some ferns I did like this, even quite small ones, and this was like gathering them like a posy. And others I just put onto a blob of glue. So there's loads of different techniques, and I'm going to show you a handful of them, and then you can go away and improvise and make your own. So first up, for all the ones that have got long strips of wire, I'm going to glue them on first because they need a bit of time to go off before you can bend them, and I'll leave them overnight. So I'm pulling out, this is a very plain looking fern leaf. It's shiny on one side where I had plastic to get it to cut better. I did find these little ferns cut really well out of paper, and actually you can't see the pattern on them because they're so small. So if you're doing really small ferns, paper's great. If you're doing larger ones or you want the smooth finish, then basically this plastic needs to be done. So what we need is some wire. Now you can buy green florist wire if you want. I don't have any and I was being lazy, so I've got magnet wire, and this is just plain old magnet wire. And I'm going to cut it into long enough lengths that it can go along the fern and then down on a stem as well. So I'm just going to cut some of these lengths out and worry about straightening it in a minute. It took me a whole afternoon to glue all of this last lot on, so I'm not going to bore you by sitting all the way through here. So I'm just going to show you a couple of the different leaves and how I would glue them. Big so you can see it, but not probably one that I would do this size. So here we are. Now I'm gluing onto the shiny side on all of these, and that's because when they're sprayed, the paper might expand a little, but the plastic probably won't. And if you want it to expand, you want the top layer to expand so they curve down rather than them curving up, because very few leaves curve up. So what we're going to do is put the plastic underneath, and these wires go underneath. So we're just going to line everything up to go underneath. So to glue these down, I'm just going to use white glue. Now, I use white glue and no problem with the paper, but I just find the plastic's a little bit shinier, so I'm worried it's going to come off. But if I was to use something more like super glue, it's very brittle glue. So I'm going to make sure there's plenty of glue on, and hopefully as it sets, it will do a nice finish and won't come off. So just straighten these out as much as you can. Doesn't matter because they're going to be bent eventually. And then just a little bit of white glue Okay, I'm actually going to put this out of the way. So I'm just going to put this down. Here we go. Get rid of any big globs. And just to the end of the, coming up where the middle is. And to make sure it stays down because it's still bent, I'm just going to put this weight. This one, so I'm going to make sure that this is actually curved in the right angle for this fern, which this more or less is already. So I'm just going to put the glue on. Need to come a bit further down on my gluing. There we go. Okay, and then a weight. There we go. You can always move the paper a little bit with these. There we go. If you're worried, you can put a second weight on. But it doesn't really matter. And afterwards, of course, the paper will curve with the wire. So it's only this initial phase. And then this one, I'm just going to straighten this up. I just find pulling it straight works well enough for this. Okay, and just line it up with the bottom because you want the wire to come out the bottom. And these are just my weights. It's been a busy week and all of these have now got stuck together. So it took a while, and I've got to say with the shiny plastic, white glue sometimes comes off, but generally sticks when I put it down a second time. So it's just something to watch. If you're doing it with paper, you don't have this problem, it just sticks so much better. So what we need to do now is make these into ferns, and here's some examples. So I'm going to start with these bog standard sorts of ferns, and I'm going to just divide them up so I've got big and small in all of the different piles, so I can end up with a mix in each of them. And it's just start with the biggest ones. It's quite a big one. You just bend these neatly into a nice sort of shape. And you can see straight away some of them are coming off a little, and that's fine. You can solve that with just a little dab of super glue and a little bit of zapper. And it's partly because it's the plastic. I didn't have this problem at all when I was just using paper, but I do find the plastic's just a little bit more hard to stick things to. So there we go. And then I'm going to curve all of these before I start because it's just easier. And then when you've done it, pick your sort of 2, maybe 3 smallest ones, which I think are these, and you put them in a nice little arrangement. And this is where you really start sticking everything together. And then you get some super glue and you just use it to glue these stems together. Now I've tried doing it with more in my hand, a little bit of zapper unless you're very patient. I've tried doing it with more in my hand and they start going out of shape and it gets very frustrating very quickly. So I just do that, there's 3. And we're aiming for, in this technique, for a nice open plant like this. And you can tease them back out again if you want later, but what I'm looking for at the moment is just something that I can control. So another. And the large, so then you move on to the larger ones and they go just a little bit further down because they grew earlier. And what you'll find is they like to all settle into the same sort of places that you might have had previously. Now don't make it too even. This is a natural plant. It probably won't be amazingly even. And I've tried twisting these to try and get a bit more sort of stem and things, and it just didn't look any better. So, oops, a bit more super glue needed. Make make sure they're held nice and firm. You can always retwist them once you've zapped them and the stems are solid. I'm not worried if the stems stick down a lot because we'll trim them after they're painted, because it's a nice little handle for holding them at the moment. Okay, so there we have a nice little fern plant, and if you're not very happy, you can just pull some of them out a little bit, get a little bit more spread. Depends how spread out you want it to be. But it's quite an open one. So next, with the smaller ones, these are slightly smaller, I'm going to do a firmer bouquet of ferns. Okay, now you can see most of my gluing's down here, but actually I'm probably going to cut it about here. So I'm just going to make sure I put another, just a collar of super glue at the top here. Actually, I'm just going to put it from this. Because I don't need this to be such a long stem, I'll keep it long just for now, but I can just put a little bit of this in to just give me something solid when I come to cut it. So you can see the difference. This is a very tight bunch, more like a tropical fern. This is more like a bracken, it's much looser. You can tease it out. Now for these ones, you need super glue and you need some zapper. And I get these leaves and I put them with the plastic side up. I take one of these, slightly bent, because I'm not that fussed. Put this over here. I want them so that this face is down. I put that at the end, put a little drip on, put that at the end of the leaf, and then just spot on some of this, which sets it instantly. Now, there we go. And then you have a leaf ready to be made into a plant. So the next type of plant we're going to try and make is something like this. Now this only works really well in the large scales because you need quite a firm hand. And what we're going to do is use a piece of wire, and I'm just using a pair of tweezers. This is just self-clamping tweezers because they hold it upright for me. Get this more or less straight. And then I've got some leaves here, and bearing in mind it's paper side down, I just take my tweezers. This is where you need the steady hand. I dip one end in the super glue, other end there, and then zap it. So there we go. It's got smaller and smaller to the top, and then I just trim the top off, leaving myself with a smaller little plant, which I can then take out and paint in a minute. So it's very easy to do those, as long as you've got a steady hand and a little bit of zapper. So next up on our show and tell is how do you make these little small ferns, which are actually really good for jungles or brackeny areas. They're less wispy. This is more bracken, that's more fern. The answer is you need a bit of foil. This is just a bit of foil that I have, and some white glue. So just a bit of white glue, and you literally just put a blob on. And then you take your ferns, and starting with your biggest ones, I'm going to use these ones. So starting with your biggest ones, you take something like an X-Acto knife, which is curved. You wrap them around it and just give them a little bit of a curve. It doesn't need to be very much. And then you can literally just drop them into place on here. There we go. So that's easy enough to do, and you can do them with quite a small scale. The next lot I'm going to do are really small, so a much smaller blob of glue. Sometimes you might want to do a slightly different type of fern, and I've got these ones. These ones are serrated and these ones are just pointy. I was struggling doing this technique to get them to stick upright because I want a little bit more stick. So what I used as a base was some Yoo-hoo white tack, and I just took a little bit, maybe a little bit more than that, and made a small ball so that I had something to poke my leaves into. And then I could, I mean, these ones are quite vertical, but if you want things to really stick up straight, you can just make holes and they'll stick into it. Now, you still need a bit of glue because these are not going to stay on their own. And then I've got these ones, which, let's go with these ones, are just pointy. So you can just stick them in. And what I find sometimes, I mean, they're not very rigid. So sometimes a little bit of a knife blade into the end will help if it doesn't poke in well. So if you're not satisfied with how far in it's gone, you think it's going to move, just give it a little poke down with your knife blade into this. The next sort I'm going to show you is exactly the same as this, but just has a little bit of a crimp to it. Now, I spent ages trying to work out what I could use to crimp the ends, and I think any crimping plier would work well, but I didn't seem to manage to find many, if I'm honest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these slightly bigger ones, and I eventually found a wrench thing, don't call it anything else. So I popped it on, bearing in mind that you want the plastic side down. Oops. Now this requires 3 sets of fingers, or 3 sets of hands, which I don't have. But basically I just crimp the edges using, and as you can see, with a little bit of patience and a lot of flicking it off, I just crimp the edges. It actually helps if you just roll it slightly first, so then it sits in the curve a bit better. There we go, and then you've got a crimped leaf that you can put in like this here. I tend to do this on the larger leaves for obvious reasons. Okay, wow, well, we've got several types of fern and leaf, and these are coming out of little crevices out the bark, which is why they're quite one-sided. I'm going to put them out of the way to dry overnight.
Well, I've stuck and glued all of the begonias, the cheese plants, the ferns. It took quite a long time and an awful lot of extra bits of sticking back down with super glue. And I know I've said I hate sticky back plastic before. I haven't changed my mind. So much so, I've come down with a cold, hence the rather husky voice. So the next thing I did was take it out into the garage and spray it. First of all with a coat of just Halford's primer, just a bog standard grey. Very important, it's a solvent, not an acrylic base, because you want it A, to stick to that shiny plastic, and B, you want it not to make the paper swell, and a water-based primer will make the paper swell. Once I'd done that, I then moved on to spraying it with 2 colours of Vallejo, starting off with golden olive and moving on to intermediate green with a bit of a mix in the middle. Fortunately, it's a little bit blurry, but you can get the idea.
So this is the end result of all that hard work. And these squares are 1/2-inch squares. Now, I've got to say, this is for a 1/9 diorama, so they are quite big. But some of the plants that you'll see, you can see are small enough to go on an O-scale diorama and not look out of scale. And 1:35 definitely would be fine. I think you're pushing it in HO though. So on these 2 pictures, firstly, this one is the plastic backed copy paper, and it has a much smoother finish to it. And on these larger scale, and these are large scale leaves, you can see how smooth they are. Now these ones are the pastel paper, and you can see a clearly defined pattern. Now in the small scales, you won't notice this, but on these larger scale leaves, such as this cheese plant, they're really obvious. Now it's up to you whether you want to go for the ease of paper or whether you would prefer to just go with the smoothness. Now, right-hand side smooth, left-hand side less smooth. And if you look at these in close-up, you can see that's a really nice, though actually quite large leaf. Really well cut, looks good. If you look at the other plant, which is the paper, sometimes it's a little bit more, you can see the fibres of the paper pulling apart on the cut. and you can just see that pattern coming through. And ultimately, I probably will end up using both on my diorama because I need quite a lot of plants and I've done both, but I'm torn between the ease of the paper and the difficulty of sticky back plastic. And I hate sticky back plastic. The previous video cut out these particular fern leaves, and I was a bit worried about the bend in them, but actually you don't notice it when they're made up. And I'm really pleased how they've come out. They're a nice airy leaf. They look quite good as more of a taller plant actually, as well as just a fern. So I've had a bit of fun playing with them, sprayed them a nice green. Really, really happy with these. And you can see the two different types that I produced just from that one leaf pattern here.
This week, we're looking at a day in the life of the mini Cathys. What happens when the alarm goes off? Well, besides the trauma of having to get across a king-size bed, that's not quick, and the alarm getting louder and louder and louder and louder, they're not made for people like me and you, maybe, to turn off. Here's a little bit more. What is that? What's that noise? What's that noise? It's hard to turn this off. It's hard to turn these. Little girls, boys, were they? Well, that's the day started in a shock.